Okay, welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Indie Game Dev. I've actually put the real name of the thing up there. Look at that. And today I have, because I've been told bullet lists are a thing, we're going to do 10 tips for storytelling in games. Now, I hope this is useful to you guys. This is not storytelling in general. This is specifically storytelling in games, so it's made specifically to be for game developers. Maybe for people who are doing other kinds of writing, it's useful. But let's get started. I want to jump right into it. Number one, and this is the most important thing that I want you to bring away from this talk, is it's not about your world. It's about the characters in the world. When you're telling a story, the truth is, sure, people care about Middle Earth or whatever. It's nice to build a world because the world gives you things for your characters to do and things for your characters to interact with. But there's a reason why only historians read history novels, right? And even history novels. I'll give you a good example. One of my favorite periods of time, an interesting historical period, is the American Revolutionary War. I find this an incredible piece of history. It's a world-changing part of history. I have read very few novels, or excuse me, I should say books. I've read very few history books about that period that the general population are probably going to be interested in or read. And there's lots of great information in that about the world at that time and about the history and about all of that stuff. But there is a great two-novel series written by an author named Jeff Shaara about that. And it goes through the Revolutionary War through the eyes of General Cornwallis from the British side, but General Washington on the American side, General Greene, who was a lesser appreciated but extremely important general on the American side, and learning about these characters and learning about their challenges and learning about how they felt about things brings this history and brings this world to life. And when you're putting together your game world, and this is something I think a lot of game developers are guilty of, is they spend a lot of time, I want to go that way, they spend a lot of time building this very complicated world, but the characters in it are very two-dimensional and very dry, and they don't really have a lot of oomph to them. And they're like, but there's, all of this world, and people are interested in the world. Yeah, they're interested in the world, but they're interested in the characters in the world and how those characters are interacting with the world. That's the number one thing you need to take away from this, is you need to concentrate not as much on your world, but more on your characters. And when we talk about characters, when you're telling the stories of these characters, characters have desires. They have something that they want. They are defined by what they want. And this is something I think novelists are really good at. You can have your character description. Oh, he's this tall, or she's got this color hair, or she's a redhead, or she has this history, or whatever. All of that is useful information. But what's important, what the audience cares about is, what does she want? What is she trying to do in this story, right? And this is very important. Whatever it is she's trying to do can't be something that she just gets. Right? So, I mean, if you write a story and you say, this is a story about, Princess Huff and Puff, and Princess Huff and Puff really, really wants to be queen, and lucky for her, she's a princess, so one day her, mom and dad die and she becomes queen. That's not really much of a story, right? It's kind of a boring story. Now, Princess Huff and Puff's aunt kills her parents, becomes queen, exiles her to another country, and Princess Huff and Puff is locked in a cell somewhere, and she has to break out of the cell and return to her country and kill her aunt to become queen. Okay, it's a bit of a ripoff of Hamlet, I get it, but even so, that's a story, right? That's an interesting story. There's a thing that she wants, and she can't have this thing, and the thing that's preventing her from that thing is interesting, and now I'm interested in, how does she solve this problem, that conflict? What is it that the character wants? How is it that the character's not getting it? How does the character respond to that and do smart, intelligent things and fight their way to getting that goal? That's an interesting story, right? And in games, this is particularly important because the character is you, the player. And so, okay, you need to become the Lord and Savior of this kingdom. Well, there's got to be a reason why you can't do that. And there's got to be something stopping you from doing that. And learning about that, that's the interesting part of your story. So, one, stories are all about characters. Two, characters are all about conflict. If there's not conflict, I don't really care what's happening. Three, remember, this is their game, not your game. This is their story, and they want to tell their story. This is a huge problem that I see in a lot of beginning designers, because a lot of game designers, quite honestly, are frustrated novelists, and they want very badly to tell you this story, and they're very keen on, when I tell you this story, it's very important that this thing happens, and very important that this thing happens, and it's very important that the character make this decision because of this. And I get it, it's difficult to tell a story if you don't, make some stuff happen. But as much as possible, you want to give the character in the game the freedom to make their own story. And you can go very, very far with this. An interesting example of this actually is RimWorld. For those of you who haven't played RimWorld, it's a beautiful sort of open box sandbox game where you're dropped onto a world out in the rim of the galaxy somewhere, and you have some people that run around and they build a little base, and they fight off people that come and fight them. Now, you may not think of this as a story-based game, but the truth is, what's actually interesting about this game to most people is the story that they develop themselves, right? When you begin the game, they give you some characters, and they give you a little bit of background and history on these characters. They say, this character was an urchin, or this character was a spice miner, or whatever the hell the background of the character is. And you put them down, and things start happening. And players begin to build a story in their mind about, why did this character do this? And the sort of events that happen is so-and-so gets in a fight with so-and-so about this thing, or so-and-so falls in love with another one. You've got these little characters, and they're building this story, and you're moving them around. You're playing God with these characters and trying to make them fall in love, or trying to make them hate each other, or trying to make them defend the base when the people attack. And you develop a story in your mind about these people. This is so much more fulfilling for most players than it would be if there was a single character that they dropped into that game and said, this is how the character is going to act, and here's what they're going to say, and isn't it interesting to read the stuff that I wrote? In most cases in games, players would prefer option A. Now, I understand that not every game can be RimWorld, and some games do need to have stories. If you're playing a first-person shooter where you're walking through a world and characters are interact with you, and there's a real story. Some people are interested in games that have stories like that, but they still want to find places in that story to exhibit their own desires, to show what they want to do, to show how they want to react. And when you're putting a story together, it's worth going through it step by step and asking yourself, are there places in this story where the player can make a decision and can exhibit some of their own character? Now, we're making a strategy game, for those of you who don't know. It's called Last Regiment. And this has a story. The story, is quite involved. And it's basically a reason why something fell behind me. And I have a thing right here to keep the light off the green screen, and it fell. It scared me. That was a weird moment. But in any case, we're making this game Last Regiment. Last Regiment has a story, and the story is basically a reason for why is this army fighting this army in this campaign mission. Now, we railroad the player pretty hard on a lot of this story because there's not a lot of chance for you to talk and interact with people, because mostly you're just fighting. But that's not the story that the player's actually interested in a strategy game. What they're actually interested in is, how did I play my game? How did I move my characters around? How did I move these units around in this world? And in that, we have to make sure that the player has different directions that they can go. Because in a strategy game, the way that you move is actually a big part of that story. So when we make a level, we want to make sure, are there multiple routes to get to where you can go? Are there multiple different ways that you could win this level? And most people don't think of that as story, but this is very definitely story. This is what story is to a strategy game, is how do I go through the actual steps of the game and get to the end of the level? Are there different ways for me to do that? Is there a place for the player to inject himself and make decisions and have those decisions be meaningful? And then that's a way that we can make sure that we let them tell their story. This is the story of how I built my base up early in the level and attacked from the right. Oh, this is the story of how I zerged out immediately and attacked, right in the front. And do we allow for those actions to spawn interesting story events? That's how you get a good story in a strategy game. On that topic, they want to explore. They want to move around. They want to see things. Excuse me. Let them loose. Let them go do stuff. I'll tell you a story. Back when I made Far Cry, back in the day, we had a constant battle about what we called invisible walls. And the invisible walls were a fight between a couple people on the staff who were like, we have this story that we want to tell, and the story involves the character going here. So let's put walls up so we can make sure the character goes where the story is interesting. And other people on the staff, including myself, who were like, no, you can put the story here. You can put the interesting things to do and see along this sort of line. And you could just put nothing out there. And if they want to go wander around the jungle, let them wander around the jungle. Give them some hints that let them move back to where the interesting story is. But don't have them bang into a wall and be reminded, oh, no, that's not where you're supposed to go. That's not where the story is. You get to go this way. At that point, you're just like, whatever, spacebar, 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 whatever, just do what I'm supposed to do. And they don't feel that drive and that pull. We won in that argument. We got rid of all the invisible walls, and we got rid of all the canyons that you couldn't possibly get out of, etc. And we created, great big islands, and the islands allowed you to explore and find things. And we put some little people out there for you to find and feel like, oh my goodness, you saw this thing out there that you weren't supposed to see. That was cool. That was an adventure for the player. People liked that. If you look at some of the best storytelling in games, they come from games like World of Warcraft, where there is a great big huge world, and you can go anywhere and you can do anything. And here's the story. This one story about, this one character who wants this thing or whatever is built through having a couple points in this great big expansive world. And if you go to where those points are, you can continue that story. But if you want to go off of those points and go somewhere else and do something else, you can do that thing. And this gives a lot of power to the player and makes them feel, again, like they're writing their story. They're not just reading your story, they're writing their story. This is powerful, and this is how good stories get written in games. If they're smart enough to not get hurt, don't hurt them. And this is another thing that you see, and it's not just that's the obvious example about getting hurt. The don't hurt them. That's a very obvious rule, right? If I got to the end of the level and I managed to not get wounded, don't have a cutscene where like some guy comes in on a helicopter and shoots me in the head and kills me. I'm like, well, what the hell did I just play the game for? I just played the game. I got through your whole level. I didn't get killed, and then you shot me. That's the most frustrating thing in the world. If you ever put that in a story, you're doing something wrong. Players hate that. They hate when you get hurt. But it's not just getting hurt. Don't take stuff away from me. I worked really hard to build this inventory, and then boom, here's a cutscene. And in the middle of the cutscene, somebody takes away your whatever, and you don't have it anymore. Why? Why would you do that? You can put events in the game where I have to use that thing to move forward, and the player can feel like they did that thing. They put that object in a slot, or they burned that object, or they needed that object to defeat this creature. You can take stuff away from the player in gameplay where they make the decision to use it, but when you put that in a cutscene, players will get really, really angry, and they're like, why? Why did you take this away from me? Why did you hurt me? Those things are not good. There's actually a place in Last Regiment right now where we hurt it's in the tutorial even, where we hurt the player in the tutorial, and it's a place that I need to go back with the designers and talk to them about how we fix that, because we've had people play the game and they immediately say, Wait, I got through the last level of the tutorial and I didn't take a bit of damage. Why am I starting this tutorial damaged? And it's a damn good question, actually. And the reason we have it there is because we're trying to teach the player how to heal, and we need to have you be hurt to heal. We need to go back and look at how we do that again, because I have real problems with starting a level with a wounded character when I ended the last level with an unwounded character. People don't like that. Don't give them stuff that looks like you can do stuff and they can't do it. Like you put a door in a room. If you put a door in a room, that door better open. And they're like, well, we can't have all the doors open. Then don't put the door there, right? Don't tell the player that they can do stuff and then tell them that they can't do it, or don't give them something and then take it away from them without them being. Every time you take this control away from a player, you upset and you irritate players. We're here to answer questions. This is when you're trying to plot out a plot for a story. Think of it as a series of questions, right? When somebody was plotting out the novel, I'm trying to think of a good novel, Tarzan. You're plotting out the novel of Tarzan, right? The first chapter of Tarzan, Tarzan's parents are on a boat, and the boat looks like it's going to, something bad's going to happen on the boat, but we don't know what bad thing is going to happen. What bad thing is going to happen on the boat? And the answer happens in the next chapter where there's a mutiny on the boat. Oh, there's a mutiny on the boat. What's going to happen to the parents? Okay, the parents are left on the shore, and when they're left on the shore, they build their own house, and they start. And then Tarzan's mom actually goes crazy in the book. They don't put that in the Disney novel, but she goes batshit insane in the novel, and she believes she's back in London, and the apes are coming in on the house, and they're looking in on the house. What's going to happen with the apes in the house? It's this series of and Edgar Rice Burroughs was a wonderful author. He's one of my favorites, and he was really great at this sort of. Every sort of ending, every end of a chapter, there was an open question. And the next chapter was the answer to that open question. But as we get the answer to that question, that opens another question. And this is what drives somebody to keep reading your novel. The most obvious example of this, I mean, the most sort of methodical, mechanical version of this I can think of. If anyone's ever read the Hardy Boys novels, and I love the Hardy Boys novels as an example of story writing and writing, because it is the most mechanical, industrial writing I think I've ever heard of. I didn't know this when I was a kid. I was a huge Hardy Boys fan. I loved Hardy Boys novels. I read all of the Hardy Boys novels. It was only when I was older and Wikipedia was a thing that I found out that the Hardy Boys novels and the Nancy Drew novels and, oh, I forget, there were 4 or 5 other series. There was a space series. I forget. There were like 4 or 5 different series that were all written by a thing called the Strathmire Syndicate. And what the Strathmire Syndicate was, it was Canadian. There was a guy, Mr. Strathmire, and I think it was Strathmire. I might be getting the name wrong, but there was a guy, and he had the idea that you could mass produce these stories and people wouldn't know any different. And he got a room of writers put together, and he would put together just a little breakdown of how the story of each novel was going to go. Okay, Joe and Frank are going to do this, and then Joe and Frank are going to, do this. And then he would hand it to this room full of authors, and this room full of authors would just churn out these novels as fast as they could go. There were 15 or 20 authors in this room. There was no, if you ever read the Hardy Boys novels, they were written by Frank Dixon. Frank Dixon doesn't exist. There's never been, and there never will be a Frank Dixon that wrote the Hardy Boys novels. That was an invention of the Strathmire Syndicate, because they thought if they didn't, they wouldn't look very good if it was written by a room of people. So the room of people was called Frank Dixon. And there was another, I forget who wrote the Nancy Drew novels, but they gave another name to the people that wrote the Nancy Drew novels. And it was all fake. But what they were great about in their putting their stories together is every story had this step-by-step, very methodical, at the end of every chapter, what's going to happen, right? And it would always be like Joe and Frank are careening towards the cliff. The car's about to fly off the cliff. And then that's the end of the chapter. And you can't go to bed now. You can't be like, well, I'll just let him. No, you have to turn the page. And the answer was always in like the first 2 paragraphs. And then Joe turned the wheel and they were back on the road. And now, okay, well, I've started another chapter, so I guess I'm going to read the rest of the chapter. And you get to the end of the chapter, and at the end of the chapter, the murderer pulled a gun and put it to Chet's head, and Chet, what's going to happen now? There was always this right, and this classic cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. When you're putting your story together, think about it like that. When your little dialogue, because it's probably going to break down with, gameplay, big hunk of dialogue, characters talk together. At the end of that characters talking together, why do I play that next section? This bit of characters talking together needs to set up for me a question. I wonder what's on the other side of that cliff they talk about. I don't know. I've heard there's dangerous monsters over there. Dangerous monsters? Can't be. There's no dangerous monsters in this world. Well, you should go over there and take a look. All right, now there's a question. Are there dangerous monsters on the other side of that cliff or not? Now, that's a pretty crappy example, I know, because we all know there's going to be dangerous monsters over there. But you can think of better examples than this when you're not in front of a camera and talking on a live stream. But there's always got to be, at the end of that conversation, why am I about to go play 15, 20 minutes of game? And at the end of those 20 or 15 minutes of game, I should have some answer to the question that was asked. And now we throw up another text dialogue or another whatever, and a new question gets asked. And we just repeat that process over and over with each answer opening up another question. That's a great way. And when you plot out your novel, or I'm sorry, not your novel, when you plot out your game, your novel too, when you plot out your game, I would suggest you actually methodically go through and do that thing. What is the question that's being asked right now? What is the answer? What is that? What answer? That answer opens up what other question? Boom, 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 boom. Now you know. Now you have your plot plotted out. It's a great way to do your plot design when you're trying to put your story together. Now, when you do that thing, here's where a lot of people get lost. Is they're writing in a document somewhere, and here's all this stuff, and here's all this information. How is that going to actually get conveyed to the player? How am I actually going to take this information that you've written in your document, your story document, about here's this character and he wants this, or here's this character and she loves him, or whatever. How does the player know any of this? Now, you can do this in a couple ways. You can do this in a great big block of text at the beginning of your level that gives you a bunch of information. And every now and then those are useful to give you a quick story synopsis or a quick, here's why you're about to do the thing that you're going to do. But the truth is, a lot of people, they spacebar through those pretty quick, and they don't read those. The better way to do this is to put it in conversations with characters. And to have those conversations with characters follow that rule that I just talked about having questions and answers and questions and answers. So what I suggest, and this is actually something I have the team doing right now in putting together the story for Last Regiment, is each one of these each one of these bullet points of question, answer, I ask them, break through the conversation and tell me what pieces of information are conveyed in each one of these conversation. Maybe there's 3 conversations that happen in this section of the game. What information is conveyed in each one of those things, and who tells me that thing? So in this one, Princess Zilvera tells me that she's got Tristan locked up in a cage somewhere, or whatever. I now know these pieces of information. I know this happens here in the game. I know it happens in this conversation, and I know the person who tells it to me is this person. That's how I build my conversations. Now, once I have that outline of question, answer, and within that outline of question, answer, I have, here's the information that's given, and here's the people who give me that information. Now, the process of writing dialogue is just putting all of that into a character's voice. Now it's pretty straightforward and easy to do. So that's your sort of step-by-step process to plotting out and putting together a story for a game. And it's very important to remember at this point that your story is not something that happens around the gameplay. The story is actually the gameplay. And so don't put all of your action in those conversations. Don't put all of your action in the people talk to people and this is where you find everything out. Put that stuff in the gameplay. Have have more shorter conversations, and in between those conversations, have the player go out and do things, find things, interact with things. Don't tell them that there's a panel somewhere that can turn off the nuclear reactor. Have him go find the panel. Show the panel in the game. Let the player play a little game with a panel and turn the panel. When you're looking at your story, every place where you're giving information in your story, ask yourself, could this be turned into actual gameplay? Could this be turned into something that the player does to get this information? Every time you do that, your story gets stronger in a game. Every time you don't do that in a game, your story gets weaker. If you're going to tell somebody there's an evil guy that controls that castle, well, I better go fight that evil guy that controls the castle. And don't just tell me he's evil. Have him do some evil shit so I can see the evil shit. Put it in the gameplay. This is something... a little bit aside, this is point 9. it takes time to get places. And one of the things that I noticed my team didn't have a very good appreciation for is how big the world is and how long it takes to move armies around and to do things. And I actually put a thing together for them, and I thought this would be kind of fun to look at and share. This is on that side. Can't point on that side over there. This is a map of my game world from Last Regiment, a very, very rough, ugly map of the world of Last Regiment. And in that map, I I asked myself, how big is this? And our Last Regiment game is set in a sort of colonial style. There's people who are recolonizing a new world, and it's set in a sort of 1780s Enlightenment period setting. And so I thought to myself, how big were things there? I went and did some research and some history, and I used France as an example here, but I could have used anywhere in the world. This piece of France, by the way, is about the same size as Virginia, North Carolina, and a little bit of Tennessee. If I were to take out that same square and move it over to America, it's about the size of, 2.5 East Coast American states. This area is kind of the area in which our game takes place. Now, I actually, on my map of France right here, I went to Google and I asked Google, how long does it take to walk from place to place? And Google will happily tell you in a couple seconds how long it takes. So, for instance, to walk from Paris to La Rochelle is about 95 hours, right? Now, that's 95 straight hours of you walking along a paved road without ever, taking a break or sleeping or pooping or eating or doing anything that human beings do on a perfectly straight road. You're not hacking your way through a jungle. You're not climbing a mountain or anything like that. I don't have it in this slide presentation. I did the same thing. One of the things I like to do is I go hike in the Himalaya mountains every now and then. And while this distance here from Paris to La Rochelle, that's about halfway across Nepal. You can walk it in about 95 hours, right? If you didn't stop, you didn't do anything. Now, that same distance walked through the Himalaya mountains of Nepal would probably take you at least five to 8 times as long, because you're going up and down and the roads turn and blah, 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 blah. Now, we're in a fantasy world, and in the fantasy world, where we have armies marching around, well, the armies have got to sleep. The armies have got to hack their way through jungles and blah, 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 blah. So if I were to look at that 95 hours and just divide it by 8 and say you could do 8 solid hours of walking, that gets us something like 12 days worth of walking from Paris to La Rochelle. Again, that's 12 days of you walking 8 hours, and during those 8 hours you don't take any breaks, you don't poop, nobody gets hurt, nobody fights you. You're walking along a clear, straight, flat road. So looking at that, I did some more estimates and said, well, what if you were in a world where the roads weren't as good, where you actually had to walk along trails, where it rains some days, etc. And I started to say, okay, well, this is probably about a week's worth of walking based off of that, right? And this is a best case scenario. This is assuming that nobody fights anybody. This is assuming nobody gets a disease. This is assuming there's not a blizzard. And it's also assuming that you're walking on trails or roads that were designed to walk on. Still, to get from Port Araby, which is one of the cities in our game, along the coast to another city of White Ferry is about a week's worth of walking. If I were to walk from White Ferry all the way up to Silverwood up here, which is a thing that happens in our campaign, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And that's if you went straight, didn't talk to anybody, didn't spend an extra night in camp to talk to people in this town and ask questions, didn't have anything, nothing bad happens. So when you're putting together a big campaign story like we have in Last Regiment, you have to think about these distances, and you have to think about, how does this affect how these characters communicate with each other? If I've got a guy down here in White Ferry and there's another character up here in Silverwood, and some stuff happens to this character in Silverwood, well, how does the character in Silverwood know what happened in White Ferry? How does the character in White Ferry know what happened to the character in Silverwood? It's a good solid 5 to 6 weeks just to walk over and tell them about it. Well, maybe they have a magic spell, blah, blah, blah. These are all things that you have to think about when you're putting your story together. And I find that because young people today grew up in a world with cheap long distance phones and Skype and internet and blah, 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 where everything is immediately understandable all around the world, we forget about this aspect of storytelling. You know, not most, but a lot of video games are made in historical periods where these things simply weren't true. And you have to think about these questions, even in the Revolutionary War, which happens in a space about the same size as France. Most of the war was fought in about 4 or 5 states in America. It's an area about this size. There were entire armies that didn't know where other armies were for months on end. They had no information about battles that had been won for months on end. Had no information about where things were going. This lack of information, this lack of understanding of what's going on. This is a huge part of the story of the American Revolution or any other big thing that happens in those times. So this is something to think about as well. And then the last one, and this is something that I keep catching my team with, is the world is a very big, complex place, and it's very diverse, and you're only one small part of it. You know, I get questions from my designers as they're putting the story together every now and then about, you know, how do orcs feel about elves? Well, okay, let's put that in a Earth perspective. How do Japanese people feel about Chinese people? Sounds kind of racist when you say that, doesn't it? Because it is, right? And it's not really a valid question. I don't know how Chinese people feel about Japanese people. I know how that Chinese person feels about Japanese people. I know how that Japanese person feels about that Chinese person, right? And that's a much better way to look at things, to look at it through the view of particular individuals and particular characters. People ask questions like, you know, in this war, how did Japan fight? Well, there was an Imperial Japanese Army, there was an Imperial Japanese Navy, there were armies that were controlled by, you know, there were different groups of the Imperial Japanese Army, there was a group in Taiwan, there was a group in China, there was, this how did the army behave is not a valid question in a historical perspective. And in a storytelling perspective, it's a meaningless question. We're more interested in how did the particular characters involved in this story behave? How did the particular groups that these characters belong to, not big, huge groups, not humans or elves, but this tribe of elves, this tribe of goblins, this family of humans, this one group of adventurers that went into this one cave. These smaller groups of people, these are far more interesting because they have actual characters attached to them, and they may feel very differently about things than other people did. This is worth looking into. Going back, and I keep talking about the American Revolution just because it's a good example to keep going back to. We can ask, you know, how did Americans feel about the American Revolution? That's not a valid question because there were lots of different feelings about the American Revolution. There were a lot of people during the American Revolution who thought it was just fine and dandy to be British and didn't want any part of the revolution. And a lot of them had to flee America at the end of the war because there were people who were unhappy with how they behaved during the revolution and thought that they were traitors. Had the Americans lost the war and the British won, we would have had a very different history where those people probably would have stayed in America. They wouldn't have gone home to Britain. And a lot of Americans who we now consider, you know, great people like George Washington, they would have been hung as traitors, right? There's a wonderful figure in history, a guy named Benedict Arnold. And you've probably heard the name Benedict Arnold if you're from America. It's a slur that we use in America to talk about a traitor. Don't be a Benedict Arnold. Well, he was a real guy during the American Revolution. And prior to the American Revolution, he was a British soldier. Like many people in the American Army were, George Washington had been a British soldier before the war. You know, that's how civil wars work. And Benedict Arnold had been a very successful soldier in the British Army. When the American Revolution happened, he was on the American side. And he fought for the Americans. He fought in a number of battles. He did very well in the number of battles that he fought during the American Revolution. Somewhere near the end of the American Revolution, however, he got involved with a woman who had very expensive tastes, and he was very pissed off because he felt that he had not gotten the press that he should have gotten for his victories and his successes. His commanding officer was a jerk and took a lot of credit for the stuff that he had done. He was very disenfranchised. He was upset, and he had a lot of need for money. And so he became a traitor and sold information to the British army. Now, we think of him as a traitor because the Americans won the war, and we killed that dude. Had the Americans lost the war, George Washington would have been the traitor. Benedict Arnold would have been the hero. He would have been the guy fighting for our country, which we'd still be British, right? There's a whole different way that this could have been looked at depending on what viewpoint you're looking at it from, what tiny, what angle are you looking at this story from? And so big, huge questions about how do the elves feel? How do the orcs feel? Step away from those questions and go back to what I talked about at the very beginning of this. Talk about characters. How do those individuals feel? What has their experience led them to feel? Think about the world in much smaller pieces. The other thing that I will say is your story doesn't have to be this Marvel Avengers, the world is going to end if you lose story. And in fact, those stories tend to lack humanity because I can't feel it. The world, I could, me, Chris, I could die tomorrow, and with the exception of 20 people, nobody would give a shit. It wouldn't be a big deal, right? In another 2 years, with the exception of probably my immediate family, most people would largely forget that I existed, right? And that's not like me being depressed. That's just the way the world works. And so these huge stories about, the world is going to end, or the great, sword of Grayskull is going to destroy all humans. It doesn't have to be that big, right? It could just be my town, or my family, or my husband, or whatever. It can be a small thing that could be destroyed, but a thing that is important to my characters. These characters, my daughter is one of the most important things in the world to me. And the idea that anything terrible could happen to my daughter, I can't even begin. Hundreds of people are dying right now from coronavirus. I don't give a shit, right? But, and that's not me being hard. I mean, I'm going on with my life, right? It's not like I woke up this morning and started crying about what happened in China, right? And most people didn't. But you know what? If my daughter was sick, this would suddenly get really, really important, because my daughter is important to me, and it's about characters. So I would suggest strongly that when you're putting your stories together, it's not always about the entire world is separated into black and white and blah, blah, blah. Bring it down to a smaller level. Bring it down to families and interactions, girlfriends, wives, husbands, lovers, good friends, old friends from the army, whatever. These are great, interesting stories. And if you go back and you look at great literature, most great literature is written about these real life interactions and real life characters that are dealing with human-sized events. That's something I can get my teeth into. That's something I can fully understand. So those are my 10 big tips. I hope that was useful to you. I think I managed to do this in 45 minutes, half an hour. I hope it was less than an hour. I don't know how long this was, but I kept it short this time. If you have any questions, there's a Discord link right there at the bottom. Come talk to me at the Discord link. If you disagree, I'd love to hear it. If you've got some other points and things you want to bring up, I'd love to hear it. All that stuff's at the Discord link. Thank you very much. We'll be back next week. I'm going to talk about other stuff. I hope you're enjoying these. And if there's anything you'd like to know, again, go to the Discord link and let me know. Thank you very much.